In the winter of 1819, on a narrow stone street in Edinburgh, a man collapsed without warning. There was no carriage accident, no visible wound, no blade, no fall. Yet he screamed as though his body had been torn open. Witnesses described the sound as raw and animal, an outpouring of pain so convincing that passers-by instinctively searched for blood pooling beneath him. But there was none. His clothes were intact, his skin unbroken, and still, he clutched his side as if something inside him had ruptured. When physicians arrived, they expected to find an injury that explained the agony. Instead, they found a body that defied their training. His pulse raced. His breathing was shallow and erratic. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. Every sign of extreme physical trauma was present, except the trauma itself. When questioned, the man did not speak of illness or accident. He spoke of another person. Somewhere else. Someone whose suffering, he claimed, had suddenly become his own. At first, the doctors assumed hysteria or deception. Edinburgh was no stranger to the dramatic. Pain, after all, could be feigned. But as they examined him more closely, something unsettling emerged. The pain was precise. Not vague or generalized, but localized, described with anatomical accuracy. He pointed to specific regions of his body, tracing lines and depths that suggested more than imagination. And as the hours passed, the intensity fluctuated in a pattern that seemed to follow an invisible event occurring beyond the room. Later that day, word reached the city of a violent injury sustained by another man several streets away, an injury that matched, with disturbing accuracy, the pain location and severity described by the patient. The timing aligned too closely to dismiss. What unsettled the physicians was not merely coincidence, but repetition. This was not the first time such an episode had been reported. It was simply the most dramatic. Edinburgh in 1819 was a city caught between enlightenment and darkness. It was hailed as a centre of medical advancement, yet its progress was built on grim foundations, dissecting rooms supplied by grave robbers, surgeries performed without anesthesia, and theories of the human body that blurred science with superstition. Pain was poorly understood. The nervous system was still a mystery, and the brain's role in perception was only beginning to be explored. In this uncertain landscape, strange cases were not uncommon. But this one was different. It did not fit the known categories of disease, nor did it behave like madness. The man insisted he was not imagining the pain. He did not describe visions or voices. He described sensations, burning, tearing, crushing, sensations that arrived suddenly and left him weakened long after they subsided. He claimed no control over them. They came when others were hurt, sometimes people he knew, sometimes people he had never met. And on more than one occasion, the pain arrived before news of the injury itself. Doctors recorded their observations with careful language, avoiding conclusions they could not defend. They noted the sincerity of his distress, the absence of physical cause, and the disturbing correlations between his suffering and external events. Some suggested nervous sympathy, a poorly defined concept at the time that proposed certain bodies were unusually sensitive to the suffering of others. Others suspected moral imagination, an overactive mind generating physical symptoms. But none could explain how imagination might produce such precise, consistent pain without prior knowledge. As the man lay on examination tables, screaming for wounds he did not have, Edinburgh's medical community was forced into uncomfortable territory. If the pain was real, and all evidence suggested it was, then its source was not located in flesh or bone. It existed somewhere else, in nerves that reacted to distant stimuli, in a mind that responded to suffering as if boundaries between bodies did not exist. Witnesses describe how his episodes often began abruptly. He would stiffen, his face draining of color, his hands trembling. Sometimes he cried out the moment an injury occurred elsewhere, as though his body had received a signal before any messenger could arrive. At other times, the pain came in waves, escalating and receding in a rhythm that mirrored the progression of another person's injury. Shock, agony, weakening, sometimes death. When that other suffering ended, his often did too, leaving him exhausted, shaken, but alive. To modern ears, the story sounds impossible. But to the doctors of 1819, impossibility was not grounds for dismissal. Medicine was filled with phenomena that defied explanation. They were accustomed to documenting what they did not understand, trusting that future knowledge might bring clarity. And so they wrote. They measured. They observed. They argued among themselves in lecture halls and private correspondence, careful to avoid ridicule while unable to suppress their unease. Rumours spread beyond medical circles. Some whispered that the man was cursed. Others suggested divine punishment or supernatural sensitivity. In taverns and drawing rooms, his story became distorted, exaggerated, and feared. But within the quiet rooms of hospitals and studies, the tone was different. There was no talk of ghosts or miracles. There was only the growing realization that pain, long assumed to be a direct consequence of injury, might not obey the rules they had trusted. What frightened the physicians most was not the mystery itself, but its implications. If one man could feel pain inflicted on another, then pain was not confined to the body that suffered injury. It could cross space. It could exist independently of tissue damage. And if that were true, then the foundations of medical certainty were far less stable than anyone wanted to admit. The man at the center of this case did not seek attention. He did not profit from his condition. In fact, his episodes isolated him. People avoided him, unsure whether his presence invited misfortune. Doctors debated whether observation itself was ethical, whether studying him prolonged his suffering. Yet no one could look away. Each new episode threatened to unravel established understanding of the human body. This was not a story of a single collapse on a winter street. It was the beginning of a medical disturbance that would ripple quietly through archives and footnotes, unsettling those who encountered it. A man who bore no wounds yet screamed for them. A body that reacted to injuries it did not sustain. A case that forced medicine to confront a question it still struggles with today. Where does pain truly live? In 1819, there was no answer. Only a man trembling on cold stone floors, doctors whispering over their notes, and a city proud of its progress confronted by something it could neither cut open nor cure. And in that silence, between injury and sensation, between one body and another, the mystery took root. To understand why the events of 1819 were taken seriously at all, it is necessary to understand the city in which they occurred. Edinburgh at the beginning of the 19th century was not merely a place of learning. It was a city obsessed with the human body. Its narrow streets and towering stone buildings concealed lecture halls, anatomy theatres, and private rooms where the dead were opened in the name of knowledge. Medicine here was not abstract theory. It was visceral, physical, and often brutal. Pain was not an unfortunate side effect of treatment. It was an expected and unavoidable part of it. Edinburgh had earned its reputation as one of Europe's most advanced medical centres, drawing students from across Britain and the continent. Surgeons trained here believed they were standing at the edge of enlightenment, peeling back centuries of ignorance. Yet their understanding of the body remained fragmented. Organs were mapped, bones named, muscles catalogued, but the nervous system was still a shadowy network whose true function remained elusive. The brain was regarded less as the seat of experience and more as a mechanical organ, poorly understood and rarely trusted to explain phenomena that felt too strange or subjective. Pain, in this world, was not yet neurological. It was described in moral and physical terms. Some pains were thought to arise from inflammation or injury. Others were attributed to imbalances of bodily fluids, or disturbances of the nerves that were poorly defined and even more poorly measured. Emotional states, fear, grief, guilt, were widely believed to manifest as physical suffering. This belief did not sit on the fringe of medicine. It was woven into its foundations. A patient's temperament mattered. Their character mattered. Their imagination mattered. This was also an era before anesthesia. Surgical pain was immediate, public, and expected. Patients were held down by assistants, their screams considered a grim but necessary accompaniment to progress. Surgeons judged one another by speed as much as precision. In such a culture, pain was not questioned. It was endured. It was feared. And it was rarely doubted when expressed convincingly. Yet for all its confidence, Edinburgh medicine was deeply insecure. Knowledge was advancing rapidly, but methods for verifying truth lagged behind. Diagnosis relied heavily on observation, reputation, and the authority of senior physicians. Instruments were crude. There were no scans, no blood tests, no way to peer inside a living body beyond touch and inference. As a result, unexplained cases were not dismissed outright. They were recorded, debated, and quietly filed away, waiting for a future that might make sense of them. The city itself contributed to this uneasy environment. Edinburgh was divided sharply between wealth and poverty, enlightenment and exploitation. The same institutions that trained brilliant surgeons depended on corpses obtained through morally dubious means. Grave robbing was so common that families guarded fresh burials, and the line between scientific necessity and criminal activity was blurred beyond recognition. This atmosphere fostered a strange tolerance for ethical ambiguity. If disturbing methods could be justified in the name of progress, then disturbing cases could be tolerated as well. Medical lectures often blurred into performance. Students crowded into steeply tiered theatres, watching as bodies were dissected and theories proclaimed with confidence that outpaced evidence. Questioning authority was risky. Reputation was everything. A physician who publicly admitted ignorance risked professional ruin. And yet, privately, many acknowledged the limits of their understanding. Letters between doctors reveal a constant undercurrent of doubt, a recognition that the body did not always behave according to the rules being taught. In this context, reports of sympathetic pain, one body reacting to the suffering of another, were not immediately absurd. The concept of sympathy was widely used to describe unexplained connections within the body. Organs were thought to communicate through invisible channels. Emotional shock could supposedly damage the heart or lungs. Women were diagnosed with hysterical illnesses that migrated through the body without anatomical logic. The idea that pain could be triggered without direct injury was already accepted. What made the 1819 case unsettling was not that pain appeared without cause, but that its cause seemed to lie outside the body entirely. Religion and science coexisted uneasily in Edinburgh's medical circles. While public discourse emphasized rationality, many physicians still believed in divine order shaping the human frame. Some interpreted unexplained suffering as evidence of moral imbalance or spiritual sensitivity. Others rejected such ideas but lacked alternatives. As a result, medical language of the period often drifted between physiology and philosophy, describing symptoms in terms that sound vague and evasive to modern ears but reflected genuine uncertainty. Social attitudes toward illness further complicated matters. Pain carried moral weight. A stoic patient was admired. One who complained excessively risked being labeled weak, hysterical, or deceptive. Yet when pain appeared uncontrollable and extreme, it commanded attention. It forced observers to confront the possibility that suffering could exist independently of character or will. The man who collapsed in 1819 did not fit comfortably into any category. He was neither stoic nor theatrical. His pain seemed to overwhelm him rather than serve him. Edinburgh's status as a medical capital meant that unusual cases attracted notice. Physicians were eager to document anomalies that might distinguish their practice or advance theory. At the same time, they were cautious. Publishing claims that could not be substantiated invited ridicule. As a result, many strange cases survived only in private notes or marginal references, stripped of interpretation but preserved as evidence of something unresolved. The city's intellectual climate encouraged classification, but reality resisted neat labels. Disorders of the nerves were especially troublesome. Terms like nervous disorder or sympathetic affliction served as placeholders rather than explanations. They acknowledged abnormality without defining mechanism. In such a framework, a man who felt pain corresponding to injuries in others was not immediately dismissed as mad. He was unsettling precisely because he exposed the emptiness behind accepted terminology. Even the public, accustomed to suffering as part of daily life, reacted with unease rather than disbelief. Industrial accidents, disease, and violence were common. Pain was familiar. But pain that appeared to leap from one body to another suggested a vulnerability that could not be defended against. It implied that suffering was contagious in ways no quarantine could prevent. By 1819, Edinburgh medicine stood at a crossroads. Its confidence was real, but so were its blind spots. The tools to investigate cases like this did not yet exist, but the willingness to observe and record did. This combination, ambition paired with ignorance, created the perfect conditions for a mystery to be taken seriously without being solved. The man's case entered this world not as a curiosity, but as a challenge. It forced physicians to confront the possibility that their understanding of pain was fundamentally incomplete. And in a city that prided itself on mastery over the human body, that possibility was deeply unsettling. The man at the center of the case did not arrive in Edinburgh as a spectacle. He did not present himself as a curiosity, nor did he seek the attention of physicians for fame or favor. By the time doctors began to take notice, he was already known among a small circle of acquaintances as someone delicately constituted, a phrase often used in the early 19th century to describe a person whose health seemed unusually fragile without any obvious disease. He was of ordinary appearance, unremarkable in height and build, and carried himself with the quiet reserve expected of the period. Nothing about him suggested deception or performance. Little is known about his early life, and what survives comes from scattered remarks in medical notes rather than personal testimony. He appears to have been literate, articulate, and capable of describing his sensations with clarity. This alone distinguished him from many patients of the era, whose complaints were often filtered through physicians rather than recorded in their own words. When he spoke of pain, he did so precisely, naming locations, depths, and qualities that suggested careful self-observation rather than exaggeration. The first time physicians formally examined him, they were struck by how little there was to observe physically. His skin bore no scars corresponding to the agony he described. There was no swelling, no discoloration, no sign of inflammation. Yet his body behaved as though it were injured. Muscles tightened involuntarily. His posture shifted to protect areas of imagined harm. At times, he became so weak he could barely stand. These reactions were not easily faked, especially under prolonged observation. Those who knew him described a pattern that repeated with unnerving consistency. He would be going about ordinary activities, walking, reading, conversing, when he would suddenly pause, as if struck by an unseen force. His expression would change first. Color drained from his face. His hands trembled. Then came the pain, sharp and overwhelming, focused on a specific part of his body. He often cried out, not in panic, but in confusion, as though trying to understand what was happening even as it unfolded. What made these episodes impossible to ignore was their apparent connection to the suffering of others. On several occasions, people close to him later learned that someone else, a friend, an acquaintance, sometimes even a stranger, had been injured at the exact moment he experienced pain. The injuries varied: broken limbs, deep cuts, crushing trauma. Yet the location and severity of his pain appeared to mirror those injuries with unsettling accuracy. When the other person's condition worsened, so did his. When they recovered, his pain subsided. When they died, his agony often ended abruptly, leaving him shaken and exhausted. Physicians struggled to determine how much the man knew about these other injuries at the time they occurred. In some cases, it was clear he could not have known. News traveled slowly, and there were no immediate messengers. And yet he reacted as though informed instantly. Doctors questioned him closely, attempting to uncover any prior awareness or emotional anticipation that might explain his reactions. They found none. He expressed genuine surprise when told of the injuries that seemed to correspond to his pain. His personal relationships became a subject of scrutiny. Some speculated that he was unusually empathetic, emotionally entangled with the suffering of those around him. Others suggested that unconscious observation, subtle cues, tones of voice, or rumors might have triggered his responses. But these explanations faltered when applied to incidents involving people he barely knew or had never met. The web of connection appeared too thin to account for the intensity of his reactions. Living with this condition isolated him. People grew uneasy in his presence, fearing that his pain signaled impending misfortune. Invitations dwindled. Conversations became strained. Even those sympathetic to his suffering did not know how to respond when he suddenly cried out for wounds that did not exist. He was neither contagious nor dangerous, yet he embodied a reminder of vulnerability that many preferred to avoid. Doctors, meanwhile, debated whether his condition was deteriorating his overall health. Repeated episodes left him fatigued, thin, and emotionally strained. His sleep was poor. He lived in constant apprehension, knowing that pain could arrive without warning, triggered by events beyond his control. Some physicians worried that the anticipation itself might be worsening his state, creating a feedback loop of fear and suffering. Others observed that even during periods of relative calm, he never fully recovered his strength. Despite this, he did not exhibit signs of delusion in other areas of life. He managed his affairs competently. He conversed rationally. He did not claim supernatural powers or special insight. He described his experiences reluctantly, often apologizing for the inconvenience they caused others. This reluctance made it difficult to dismiss him as attention-seeking. If anything, he seemed embarrassed by his condition. Medical examinations grew more invasive as curiosity intensified. Physicians tested his sensitivity to touch, heat, and pressure, comparing his responses during episodes and during periods of calm. They found no consistent abnormalities. His reactions to direct stimulation were unremarkable. The pain he described did not correspond to heightened sensitivity or injury in his own tissues. It appeared to arise independently, as if imposed upon his body from an external source. Some doctors began to suspect that the act of observation itself might be influencing his symptoms. They wondered whether discussing his condition reinforced it, embedding expectations that shape his experience. Yet this hypothesis failed to explain episodes that occurred in solitude, without witnesses or prior conversation. The pain did not require an audience. Over time, the man's case became less about him as an individual and more about what he represented. He embodied a challenge to the assumption that pain was private and contained. His body reacted as though boundaries between selves were permeable. For physicians trained to see the body as an isolated system, this was deeply unsettling. He never offered an explanation of his own. When asked why he thought this happened, he admitted he did not know. He spoke not of curses or divine purpose, but of confusion and fear. He wanted relief, not meaning. This absence of interpretation frustrated some doctors and reassured others. It suggested sincerity, but it also left them without a narrative to contain the phenomenon. As months passed, references to his case accumulated in private notes and discussions. Yet no consensus emerged. Some physicians quietly distanced themselves, uncomfortable with a case that resisted resolution. Others remained fascinated, hoping that further observation might reveal a pattern or mechanism. The man himself remained caught in the middle, examined, discussed, and increasingly exhausted by an experience no one could alleviate. In the end, what made his case endure was not the drama of any single episode, but the quiet persistence of the pattern. Again and again, his pain aligned with the suffering of others. Again and again, examination revealed nothing that could account for it. And in that repetition, medicine confronted a question it was not prepared to answer. What happens when the body suffers for reasons that lie beyond itself? As physicians continued to observe the man, their attention shifted from the events surrounding his pain to the body that appeared to betray every rule they relied upon. Each episode became an opportunity to search for physical evidence that might finally anchor his suffering to anatomy. They examined his skin for discoloration, swelling, or temperature change. They pressed along muscle and bone, searching for tenderness that might reveal hidden injury. Time and again, they found nothing that could justify the severity of his distress. And yet, his body responded as though it had been deeply wounded. During attacks, his posture changed instinctively. He guarded specific areas, curling inward or bracing himself against furniture as if protecting a fresh injury. His breathing grew shallow and irregular, consistent with acute pain. His pulse accelerated, sometimes to alarming levels, and his face took on the ashen pallor physicians associated with shock. These signs were not easily fabricated. They were involuntary, physiological reactions that reinforced the reality of his suffering even as they defied explanation. What unsettled doctors most was the precision of his pain. He did not speak in vague terms. He identified exact locations, an arm, a rib, a thigh, and often described depth and sensation with remarkable consistency. Burning, crushing, tearing. At times, he described pain that radiated along specific pathways, echoing what surgeons observed when nerves were damaged. And yet, his own nerves, when tested directly, behaved normally. There was no heightened sensitivity, no numbness, no lasting impairment. Physicians began to chart his episodes meticulously, noting onset, duration, intensity, and resolution. Patterns emerged. The pain often arrived suddenly, without warning. It could persist for hours or days, then fade as abruptly as it began. Relief did not come from rest or medication, but seemed linked to events occurring elsewhere. When news arrived that another person's injury had stabilized or healed, his pain diminished. When complications arose, his suffering intensified. This correlation was deeply troubling, as it suggested a connection that bypassed physical contact entirely. Medical language of the period struggled to contain such observations. Doctors used terms like sympathetic affection or nervous correspondence, phrases that acknowledged abnormality without explaining it. These were conceptual placeholders, ways of naming ignorance without admitting defeat. The idea that nerves might respond to distant stimuli was not entirely foreign, but no mechanism existed to support it. Electricity was still poorly understood, and neural signaling remained speculative. Some physicians considered whether the man's pain might be a form of imitation, an unconscious mirroring of injuries he had previously witnessed. But this theory faltered under scrutiny. His episodes were not limited to familiar injuries or situations. They varied widely, reflecting traumas he could not have anticipated. Moreover, His reactions lacked the theatrical quality often associated with imitation or hysteria. There was no exaggeration, no flourish, only raw distress. Others proposed that his body might be unusually susceptible to emotional shock. The concept of nervous temperament was frequently invoked to explain conditions that defied physical examination. According to this view, certain individuals possess nerves so delicate that emotional stimuli could provoke severe bodily reactions. Yet even this explanation seemed insufficient. Emotional shock could account for generalized illness, perhaps even pain, but it did not explain specificity. Why should emotional disturbance produce pain in the exact location of another person's injury? The absence of visible injury forced physicians to confront the limitations of their tools. Without the ability to visualize internal processes, they relied on external signs and patient testimony. In this case, testimony was unusually consistent and corroborated by external events. The body, however, offered no clues. It was as though the source of pain existed beyond the reach of scalpel and probe. Repeated episodes took a toll on the man's physical state. Between attacks, he appeared weakened, his appetite diminished, his sleep fragmented. Doctors debated whether the pain itself was causing lasting harm or whether some underlying condition was being exacerbated by stress. They monitored his weight, his complexion, his strength, searching for signs of decline. While he did not waste away dramatically, he never fully recovered. Each episode left a residue of exhaustion that accumulated over time. Some physicians grew uneasy with the intensity of observation. They wondered whether constant scrutiny might be reinforcing his condition, embedding expectations that shape his experience. The idea that belief could generate pain was gaining traction, particularly in cases of hysteria. Yet this line of reasoning was deeply uncomfortable. It implied that pain might not require injury at all, that the body could produce genuine suffering based on perception alone. In the man's case, however, belief did not seem to precede pain. The episodes arrived unbidden, often in ignorance of any external trigger. Attempts at treatment were cautious and largely ineffective. Physicians prescribed rest, dietary adjustments, and calming regimens intended to soothe the nerves. Some suggested isolation from stressful influences. Others recommended engagement and distraction. None produced lasting improvement. Pain did not respond predictably to intervention. It followed its own logic, one that appeared external to the patient's immediate circumstances. As the case progressed, the man's body became a site of philosophical tension. On one level, it behaved according to known physiological responses to pain. On another, it violated the assumption that pain must arise from local injury. This contradiction forced doctors to reconsider foundational ideas about sensation. If pain could be experienced without damage, then what distinguished physical pain from imagined pain? And if imagined pain produced real physiological responses, where did imagination end and pathology begin? The man himself became increasingly anxious about his body's unpredictability. He spoke of feeling like a conduit rather than an individual, as though his physical boundaries were unreliable. This language alarmed some physicians, who worried it signaled psychological deterioration. Yet his self-awareness remained intact. He did not believe himself chosen or special. He felt invaded, not empowered. This distinction mattered, as it separated his experience from delusion and placed it closer to involuntary affliction. The longer the case persisted, the more it exposed medicine's discomfort with ambiguity. Doctors were trained to locate disease within the body. Here, the body offered no location. Pain existed, undeniably, but it refused to be pinned down. It moved, appeared, and vanished according to a pattern that lay beyond direct observation. In the end, what disturbed physicians was not simply that they could not explain the man's pain, but that his body forced them to acknowledge the possibility that sensation was not fully contained within anatomy. His suffering suggested that pain might be relational, responsive, and influenced by factors that crossed the boundaries between individuals. For a medical tradition built on isolation and dissection, this was a deeply unsettling implication. Each examination ended the same way: notes carefully written, conclusions cautiously avoided, and a lingering sense that something fundamental had been revealed without being understood. The man's body, intact yet tormented, remained a living contradiction, one that medicine could observe, but not resolve. As the case circulated quietly through Edinburgh's medical circles, it began to attract a widening ring of observers. Surgeons, physicians, and students came not only to examine the man, but to witness him. Some arrived out of genuine concern, others driven by curiosity, and a few by skepticism sharpened into suspicion. The man himself had little control over who was permitted into these encounters. Once his case became known, it no longer belonged solely to him. It became a subject of professional debate, shaped as much by the observers as by the suffering they observed. Among the physicians, opinions divided quickly. A small group believed the man's pain was real and deserving of careful documentation, even if its cause remained obscure. These doctors tended to be methodical, recording symptoms without embellishment, reluctant to speculate beyond what they could observe. They spoke of the case as singular and remarkable, language that acknowledged its strangeness while preserving professional restraint. To them, disbelief was not an option. The physiological signs were too consistent, the correlations too precise. Others were far less convinced. Skeptics argued that coincidence and suggestion could account for the apparent links between his pain and injuries elsewhere. They pointed out that Edinburgh was a city where accidents and violence were common. Given enough time and enough incidents, some overlap was inevitable. These physicians questioned whether observers were unconsciously selecting only those episodes that fit the narrative, ignoring times when his pain did not align with any known injury. Their concern was not without merit. Confirmation bias, though unnamed at the time, was a real danger in an era that relied heavily on anecdote. Some skeptics went further, suggesting deliberate deception. They proposed that the man might be exploiting medical fascination for attention or sympathy. Yet this accusation struggled to gain traction. His behavior lacked the hallmarks of fraud. He did not exaggerate, demand reward, or cultivate an audience. On several occasions, he resisted examination, clearly distressed by the attention his condition attracted. Deception, if present, appeared to bring him no benefit and considerable discomfort. Medical students, less restrained by reputation, debated the case openly. In lecture halls and taverns, they argued over whether the man represented a breakthrough or a distraction. For some, he embodied the promise of uncovering new principles of nervous function. For others, he was a reminder of how easily medicine could be misled by dramatic anomalies. These debates were often heated, reflecting broader tensions within the profession between empirical observation and theoretical speculation. Witnesses outside the medical community added another layer of complexity. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances described episodes that occurred without doctors present. Their accounts varied in detail but shared a common theme: sudden, intense pain that seemed unprovoked. These testimonies were less precise than medical notes, yet their consistency reinforced the sense that something unusual was occurring. At the same time, their involvement raised concerns about rumor and exaggeration. Stories passed from person to person tended to grow darker, more dramatic, and less reliable. Physicians attempted to reconcile these differing perspectives by controlling observation more tightly. They arranged to be present during expected episodes, hoping to catch the pain in real time and verify correlations. On some occasions, they succeeded. They watched as the man reacted violently, then later confirmed that an injury had occurred elsewhere at the same moment. These instances strengthened belief among supporters and intensified discomfort among skeptics, who now faced evidence they could not easily dismiss. Yet even those inclined to believe struggled with interpretation. Accepting the reality of the man's pain did not mean accepting his implied explanation. Doctors were careful to separate observation from inference. They recorded what he felt and when he felt it, but avoided endorsing the idea that pain was literally transmitted between bodies. Instead, they used cautious phrasing that left room for alternative explanations. This caution reflected both intellectual humility and professional self-preservation. The reputations of those involved were quietly at stake. Publicly aligning oneself with an inexplicable case risked ridicule. Medicine was striving to establish itself as a rational science, distinct from superstition and folklore. Endorsing phenomena that sounded mystical could undermine that effort. As a result, many physicians discussed the case privately while avoiding public association. The man's suffering became a kind of open secret, known, debated, but rarely acknowledged in formal settings. Among skeptics, a recurring argument concerned the reliability of memory and timing. Human perception of time, they argued, was imperfect. Pain might be recalled as coinciding with injury when, in fact, it did not. This explanation appealed to physicians wary of extraordinary claims. Yet it failed to account for episodes witnessed directly by multiple observers, where timing was recorded precisely. These moments created fractures in skeptical narratives. forcing even doubters to acknowledge unresolved elements. As discussions continued, the case became a mirror reflecting each observer's beliefs about medicine itself. Those inclined toward physiological explanation sought hidden mechanisms within the body. Those skeptical of such mechanisms emphasized psychological influence and coincidence. Rarely did these groups persuade one another. Instead, they talked past each other, united only in their uncertainty. The man, caught in the center of this debate, grew increasingly weary. Being discussed as an object rather than a person took its toll. He expressed frustration that no one could offer relief, only questions. At times, he withdrew from observation, declining visits and examinations. This withdrawal, in turn, fueled suspicion among skeptics, who interpreted it as avoidance. Believers, however, saw it as exhaustion, a natural response to relentless scrutiny. As time passed, interest in the case waxed and waned. New anomalies emerged to capture attention, and some physicians moved on. Others remained quietly invested, continuing to record observations when possible. The lack of resolution frustrated all parties. There was no decisive experiment, no final revelation that could settle the debate. What endured was division. The case did not unite observers around a shared explanation. It exposed the fault lines within early 19th century medicine. It revealed how easily belief and skepticism could coexist, how evidence could be both compelling and insufficient, and how professional caution could silence open discussion without resolving doubt. In the end, the witnesses and physicians did not agree on what the man's pain meant. Some believed it pointed toward unknown principles of nervous connection. Others regarded it as an elaborate misinterpretation of coincidence and psychology. But even the most skeptical could not fully dismiss the discomfort the case inspired. It lingered in memory, resurfacing in conversations and notes as an example of something medicine had encountered but not mastered. The man's case became less about proof and more about limits of observation, of explanation, and of certainty. And for those who witnessed his suffering firsthand, that unresolved tension proved far more unsettling than any single answer could have been. To grasp why the case unsettled physicians so deeply, one must understand how pain, sympathy, and the human mind were conceptualized in the early 19th century. Medicine at the time did not draw the sharp distinctions modern science makes between psychological and physical experience. The mind and body were seen as intertwined in ways that resisted separation, and pain occupied a liminal space between sensation, emotion, and moral state. It was not merely something the body endured, it was something the person experienced as a whole. The concept of sympathy was central to this worldview. Sympathy did not mean compassion in the modern sense, but a kind of hidden correspondence between parts of the body, and, some believed, between different bodies altogether. Organs were thought to influence one another through invisible channels. A disturbance in the stomach could provoke headaches. Grief could weaken the heart. Fear could paralyze the limbs. These ideas were not metaphors, they were medical explanations. The nervous system, poorly understood but widely invoked, served as the conduit through which such sympathetic effects were believed to travel. Within this framework, pain could arise without visible injury. Physicians accepted that emotional shock, prolonged anxiety, or intense imagination could generate real physical suffering. Such pain was not dismissed as false. It was recognized as genuine, even if its origin could not be located in damaged tissue. The challenge lay in distinguishing between pain that arose from internal imbalance and pain caused by external harm. In many cases, the distinction was blurred beyond recognition. Imagination, in particular, was regarded as a powerful and dangerous force. Medical texts warned that vivid imagination could imprint sensations on the body, creating illness where none existed. This belief was applied unevenly, often along lines of gender and class, but it shaped how unexplained symptoms were interpreted. Patients were sometimes advised to avoid distressing sights or stories for fear that witnessing suffering might produce illness. The idea that the mind could echo pain it had observed was already present. What the 1819 case suggested, however, was something more radical: pain that echoed suffering the patient had not observed at all. Empathy, though not yet named as such, occupied an ambiguous position. Physicians recognized that some individuals were unusually sensitive to the emotions of others. They spoke of nervous sympathy as a trait rather than a disorder, a heightened responsiveness that could border on pathology. Such individuals were thought to absorb emotional shocks more readily, experiencing physical symptoms in response to distress around them. Yet this sensitivity was generally associated with vague ailments, fatigue, palpitations, headaches, not with precise, localized pain mirroring specific injuries. The man's case strained these concepts to their limits. If his pain were the product of sympathy, then sympathy itself had to be far more exacting than previously imagined. It would need to operate with anatomical precision, reproducing the location and character of distant injuries. This implication unsettled physicians who relied on sympathy as a flexible explanation precisely because of its vagueness. The case demanded specificity where none was supposed to exist. The broader intellectual climate of the time further complicated interpretation. Enlightenment ideals emphasized reason and observation, yet Romantic philosophy was gaining influence, celebrating emotion, intuition, and interconnectedness. These currents flowed through medical thought, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in conflict. Some physicians were drawn to the idea that human beings were linked through unseen forces, that suffering might resonate across individuals. Others rejected such notions as dangerously close to mysticism. Pain itself was undergoing a conceptual shift. Traditionally viewed as a direct signal of injury, it was increasingly recognized as variable and subjective. Two patients with similar wounds could experience vastly different levels of suffering. This variability troubled physicians seeking objective measures. The man's case amplified this problem by severing pain from injury entirely. If pain could exist without harm, then its role as a diagnostic tool was undermined. The language used to describe pain reflected this uncertainty. Terms like exquisite, acute, and violent conveyed intensity but not mechanism. Physicians relied on metaphor, burning, stabbing, crushing, to approximate experience. These metaphors blurred the line between physical sensation and emotional response. In the man's descriptions, doctors heard familiar language used in unfamiliar ways, as though pain were narrating events that had not occurred within his own body. Philosophical questions emerged alongside medical ones. If pain could be shared, what did that mean for individuality? Was the self bounded by skin, or did it extend beyond? These were not abstract musings. They touched on the ethical foundation of medicine. Treatment assumed that each patient's body was a discrete entity. A case that suggested permeability between bodies threatened that assumption. At the same time, physicians were wary of attributing too much power to the mind. Acknowledging that imagination or empathy could generate intense pain risked undermining trust in patient testimony. It raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility and control. If pain was produced by the mind, could it be willed away? And if not, how was such pain different from that caused by injury? The man's involuntary suffering complicated these debates, as he demonstrated no apparent ability to influence his condition. The cultural fear of madness also hovered over the discussion. Unexplained sensations were often linked to mental instability. Yet madness was associated with disordered thought, delusion, and loss of reason. The man exhibited none of these. His reasoning remained intact. His distress was specific, not diffuse. This separation of pain from madness challenged prevailing assumptions and forced physicians to consider categories that did not yet exist. As debates unfolded, some physicians began to sense that the case was exposing a deeper problem: the inadequacy of existing frameworks to account for human experience. Pain, empathy, imagination, and physiology were entangled in ways medicine could describe but not disentangle. The man's suffering was not an outlier so much as a magnifying glass, revealing tensions that had always been present but rarely confronted so directly. In private correspondence, a few doctors admitted discomfort not just with the case, but with what it implied about their own practice. If pain could not be reliably traced to injury, then certainty was an illusion. Diagnosis became an act of interpretation rather than discovery. This realization was unsettling for a profession striving for scientific legitimacy. The man's case did not resolve these questions. Instead, it intensified them. It forced physicians to confront the possibility that pain was not merely a signal from damaged tissue, but a complex experience shaped by mind, context, and perhaps connections beyond the individual. In doing so, it revealed the fragile boundary between empathy and pathology, a boundary that medicine, then and now, struggles to define. As observations accumulated, what had once seemed like a series of isolated episodes began to reveal an unsettling internal logic. Physicians who had followed the case over months and years noticed that the man's suffering was not random. It followed patterns, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. These patterns did not make the phenomenon any easier to explain, but they gave it a structure that suggested something more than chance or imagination. One of the most disturbing consistencies involved location. When the man described pain in a particular limb or region, later reports of injury elsewhere often matched with uncanny precision. A crushed hand, a fractured leg, a deep wound to the side. His pain aligned not just in general area, but in orientation and intensity. Doctors compared notes and found repeated correspondences that could not be dismissed as vague coincidence. The pain was not diffuse, it was mapped. Timing added another layer of unease. In several documented instances, his pain began at the same moment an injury occurred elsewhere, not after news reached him. Witnesses describe how he would suddenly cry out or collapse, only for confirmation of an accident to arrive hours later. In other cases, his pain fluctuated in tandem with the injured person's condition. When the other individual went into shock, his pain intensified. When the injury stabilized, his suffering eased. This synchronization was deeply troubling, as it suggested a responsiveness that defied known modes of communication. Duration also followed a pattern. The man's pain rarely resolved abruptly without external change. Instead, it lingered, sometimes for days, fading only when the corresponding injury healed or ended in death. Physicians noted with discomfort that the most severe episodes often concluded suddenly when news arrived that the injured party had died. The man would experience a brief surge of pain, followed by a rapid collapse into exhaustion and relief. This abrupt cessation raised ethical questions few were willing to voice. Was his suffering somehow bound to the continued existence of another's pain? Emotional proximity appeared to play a role, though not a consistent one. In some cases, the injured person was someone the man knew well. In others, the connection was tenuous or non-existent. Physicians struggled to identify a threshold of familiarity that might explain the link. If empathy were the cause, why did it sometimes extend to strangers? If coincidence were responsible, why did it recur with such specificity? Each attempted explanation seemed to solve one aspect while leaving others untouched. Physicians also noted a pattern of deterioration. With each episode, the man appeared slower to recover. His strength diminished incrementally, his resilience worn down by repeated assaults of pain. Though no single episode was fatal, the cumulative effect was undeniable. He became thinner, more withdrawn, and increasingly apprehensive. Anticipation itself became a source of suffering. Knowing that pain could arrive at any moment, triggered by unknown events, left him in a state of constant vigilance. This anticipation produced its own physiological effects. Doctors observed heightened nervous tension even during periods of calm. His sleep was restless. His appetite inconsistent. These changes complicated interpretation. Skeptics argued that anxiety might be amplifying his symptoms, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Believers countered that anxiety was a consequence, not a cause, a natural response to living under the threat of uncontrollable pain. Attempts to disrupt the pattern were unsuccessful. Physicians experimented with isolation, removing him from social contact to reduce potential emotional triggers. The episodes continued. They encouraged engagement and distraction, hoping mental occupation might blunt his sensitivity. The pain arrived regardless. These failures reinforced the sense that the pattern operated independently of his immediate environment. Even more unsettling were instances in which the man appeared to anticipate the nature of an injury. On rare occasions, he described sensations that later corresponded to specific trauma before details were known. Physicians recorded these moments cautiously, aware of how easily retrospective interpretation could distort memory. Yet in cases witnessed by multiple observers, the alignment was difficult to dismiss. The pain seemed to carry information, not just sensation. As the pattern became clearer, it deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Randomness could have offered comfort. Patterns implied mechanism. But no mechanism was visible. The man's body behaved as though it were responding to signals no one else could detect. This raised uncomfortable questions about perception and communication. Were there forms of connection between bodies that medicine had yet to recognize? Or was the pattern an artifact of observation, a story constructed after the fact? Physicians debated these questions in increasingly abstract terms. Some suggested that the man's nervous system might be hypersensitive to environmental cues imperceptible to others, subtle changes in atmosphere, sound, or behavior that unconsciously signaled injury. Others rejected this, noting that such cues could not account for injuries occurring out of sight and beyond earshot. The more carefully the pattern was examined, the less plausible conventional explanations became. The emotional impact on observers grew as well. Doctors accustomed to professional detachment found themselves unsettled by the sense of inevitability that surrounded the man's episodes. Each new instance reinforced the feeling that something beyond their control was unfolding. Medicine, which prided itself on intervention, could only watch. The man himself became acutely aware of the pattern. He spoke of recognizing the onset of pain not just as sensation, but as a kind of signal, a feeling that something terrible had happened elsewhere. This awareness frightened him more than the pain itself. It suggested a role he did not want and could not refuse. He was not merely suffering, he was bearing witness through his body. As time passed, the pattern transformed the case from a curiosity into a source of dread. Each episode confirmed what came before, tightening the web of correlation. Physicians who once hoped the phenomenon would resolve or reveal itself instead faced a growing body of evidence that refused to cohere into explanation. The persistence of these patterns forced medicine into an uncomfortable position. It could no longer dismiss the case as anomaly without ignoring its own observations. Yet it could not integrate the case into existing knowledge without tearing at the seams of that knowledge. The man's suffering became a kind of proof without theory, data without framework. In the end, what terrified observers was not simply that the pain repeated, but that it did so reliably. The pattern suggested order where none should exist. And in that order lay the unsettling implication that the human body might be capable of connections and responses far beyond what 19th century medicine was prepared to acknowledge. When viewed through the lens of modern medicine, the case no longer appears supernatural, yet it remains profoundly disturbing. Contemporary science offers concepts that 19th century physicians could not access: neurology, psychology, and an advanced understanding of how the brain constructs pain. And still, even with these tools, the case resists full explanation. What modern frameworks provide is not resolution, but a series of partial lenses, each illuminating one aspect while leaving others in shadow. Today, pain is understood not as a direct readout of injury, but as an experience generated by the brain. Tissue damage may trigger signals, but those signals are interpreted, amplified, dampened, or even fabricated by neural processes. This realization alone transforms how the historical case is read. The absence of physical injury no longer invalidates the man's suffering. Pain without damage is now recognized as real, measurable, and capable of producing severe physiological effects. One possible explanation lies in the phenomenon of extreme somatic empathy. Modern neuroscience has identified mirror neuron systems, networks in the brain that activate both when an individual performs an action and when they observe someone else performing it. These systems are thought to underlie empathy, learning, and social bonding. In some individuals, these responses appear unusually intense. People may flinch when others are hurt, feel nausea when witnessing injury, or experience localized discomfort in response to another's pain. Under extreme conditions, such mirroring could, in theory, produce vivid, localized pain sensations. Yet this explanation falters when applied fully to the 1819 case. Mirror responses typically require direct observation or knowledge of the injury. They do not account for pain occurring without awareness, nor do they explain synchronization with distant events unknown to the individual at the time. Empathy can amplify sensation, but it does not transmit information. Another framework considers conversion disorder, historically known as hysteria. This condition involves real physical symptoms arising without detectable organic cause, often linked to psychological stress or trauma. Paralysis, blindness, seizures, and pain can all occur in the absence of structural damage. Conversion symptoms are not voluntary, and patients experience them as genuine and uncontrollable. In this sense, the man's pain fits certain criteria: real suffering, no injury, and physiological responses consistent with pain. But conversion disorder typically reflects internal psychological conflict rather than external events. Symptoms are symbolic, not precise reflections of other people's injuries. The specificity and timing in this case remain difficult to reconcile with a purely internal mechanism. There is no clear evidence of trauma or conflict that would produce such pattern manifestations. Another avenue of explanation involves central sensitization, a condition in which the nervous system becomes hyperreactive. In such states, the brain amplifies pain signals or generates pain without input from injured tissue. Conditions like fibromyalgia and chronic regional pain syndrome demonstrate how pain can spread, intensify, and persist independent of damage. The man's gradual deterioration and heightened sensitivity could align with such a process. However, Central sensitization does not explain correspondence. It accounts for intensity, not mirroring. It explains why pain might be severe and resistant to treatment, but not why its location and timing would align with injuries elsewhere. Some modern theorists might consider synesthetic phenomena, conditions in which sensory experiences cross modalities. There are documented cases of people who feel touch when they see others being touched, or who experience physical sensations in response to sounds or words. Mirror touch synesthesia, in particular, involves feeling tactile sensations on one's own body when observing another being touched. This condition demonstrates that the brain can blur boundaries between self and other at the level of sensation. Yet again, observation is key. Known cases require perception. The historical man often lacked awareness of the injuries he mirrored. Unless one proposes unconscious perception of information, a controversial and speculative idea, the synesthesia model remains incomplete. Psychological contagion and expectation have also been proposed. Humans are adept at detecting patterns and forming narratives, sometimes where none exist. Over time, the man may have internalized a belief that pain signaled injury elsewhere, shaping his perception of sensation. Retrospective alignment could exaggerate perceived accuracy. However, this explanation depends heavily on memory distortion and selective reporting, and it weakens in cases where timing was observed and recorded by others. Modern medicine also acknowledges how little is still known about consciousness and perception. Pain is not merely a sensory event. It is constructed through networks involving emotion, memory, and meaning. The brain constantly predicts and interprets bodily states. Under rare and extreme conditions, these predictive processes can generate experiences that feel external, imposed, and uncontrollable. The man's sense of being acted upon rather than initiating sensation aligns with this understanding. What modern frameworks cannot explain is the apparent informational content of his pain. Sensations seem to correspond to events he did not consciously know. This challenges current models, which assume that perception is grounded in input, whether sensory or psychological. The idea that the brain could generate specific, timely responses to unknown external events remains speculative and controversial. Importantly, modern medicine also recognizes the danger of overconfidence. Many conditions once dismissed as imaginary are now understood as neurological or autoimmune disorders. The history of medicine is filled with cases that resisted explanation until new tools emerged. This perspective tempers dismissal. It suggests humility rather than certainty. From a contemporary standpoint, the most responsible interpretation may be that the man's suffering arose from a convergence of mechanisms: neurological sensitivity, psychological vulnerability, and pattern perception, interacting in ways not yet fully understood. This does not resolve the mystery, but it reframes it. The case becomes less about supernatural transmission and more about the extraordinary capacities of the human brain. And yet, something remains unresolved. Modern explanations describe how pain can exist without injury, how empathy can shape sensation, how the mind can generate physical reality. They do not explain why this particular man's pain seemed to map so uncannily onto the suffering of others, nor why it followed patterns that resisted randomness. In this sense, modern medicine does not close the case. It narrows the field, removes the need for supernatural explanation, and offers plausible mechanisms. But plausibility is not proof. The case remains an outlier, less inexplicable than it once was, but no less haunting. What endures is the reminder that pain is not a simple signal from body to brain. It is an experience shaped by layers of biology, psychology, and context. The man of 1819 exposed this complexity long before science had language for it. His case stands at the edge of what medicine can explain, both then and now, a reminder that understanding pain means confronting not only the body, but the mysterious architecture of the mind itself. The more the case of the Edinburgh man was studied, the more it revealed the fragile boundary between empathy and pathology. His suffering forced physicians to confront a question that medicine, then and now, struggles to answer. When does the experience of another's pain cross the line from compassionate resonance into genuine illness? In the early 19th century, the distinction between physical and mental suffering was poorly defined, and the man's condition exposed the inadequacy of existing categories. Empathy, though not fully named, was recognized as a form of nervous responsiveness. Certain individuals seemed unusually sensitive to the feelings and conditions of those around them, reacting with visceral intensity to distress. In moderation, this sensitivity was considered natural, even admirable, allowing social cohesion and moral awareness. Physicians occasionally describe such people as nervous or susceptible, noting that their emotional states could influence their health. However, the Edinburgh man demonstrated an extreme manifestation of this responsiveness. It was not merely emotional resonance, it was physiological and localized, producing real, measurable suffering. His body experienced pain that corresponded with external injury in a way that transcended ordinary sympathy. This raised profound questions about the boundaries of the self. If one person could physically suffer as a result of another's trauma, then the individual body was not a closed system. Pain, traditionally understood as a private signal of bodily harm, became relational. It could exist beyond the skin, extending to connections invisible to the observer. The implications unsettled physicians who relied on a clear demarcation between patient and environment. Diagnosis and treatment depended on the assumption that the suffering belonged to the body under observation. Here, that assumption was challenged in its most fundamental form. Medical observers attempted to locate a mechanism for this phenomenon. Could it be heightened nervous sensitivity, extreme somatic empathy, or an unprecedented form of mirror response? Each theory explained fragments of the case, but none encompassed the full complexity. Hypotheses of psychological projection accounted for intensity but not specificity. Somatic mirroring explained spatial correspondence but relied on observation that was often absent. Even modern concepts like mirror neuron activity and central sensitization illuminate aspects of the experience without resolving the core mystery, the timing and precision of his pain in relation to distant injuries. The ethical dimension also became apparent. If empathy could cause real pain, how much responsibility did the observer bear? Could physicians inadvertently exacerbate his suffering through attention and examination? The man's existence forced consideration of medical practice as intervention not only on the body, but on experience itself. Observation was no longer neutral. It could influence the severity and recurrence of episodes. Doctors began to realize that their efforts to understand might be entangled with the phenomena they sought to study. From a contemporary perspective, his case also highlights the interplay between perception and reality. Pain is constructed by the brain, filtered through expectation, context, and emotional state. Yet in the man's experience, construction seemed insufficient to account for correspondence with external events. His brain appeared to respond to stimuli beyond conscious perception, generating suffering that was as real as it was inexplicable. This challenges modern medicine's reliance on measurable stimuli and observable injury. It suggests that the mind's capacity to generate experience may extend into realms only partially understood, bridging empathy and pathology in unpredictable ways. The man's condition also underscores the isolating nature of extreme sensitivity. Social and professional responses to his suffering ranged from fascination to fear. Friends and acquaintances often withdrew, uncomfortable with the unpredictability and intensity of his episodes. Physicians oscillated between careful study and professional distance, wary of endorsing a phenomenon that might be dismissed as fantastical. For the individual experiencing this condition, isolation compounded distress. Awareness of one's vulnerability, particularly when it seems linked to the suffering of others, is itself a form of psychological burden, intensifying physical symptoms and feeding a cycle of exhaustion and fear. Throughout, the case demonstrates the limitations of classification. Medicine relies on categories: disease, injury, pathology, but the Edinburgh man defied neat labels. His pain was real, measurable in its effects, and yet it did not originate from recognized causes. It occupied a liminal space, straddling the boundary between mind and body, internal and external, empathy and illness. Observers were forced to expand their conceptual framework, acknowledging that human experience can manifest in ways that challenge established notions of causality. The broader implication is unsettling. If extreme empathy can produce real, localized pain, what other human experiences might operate at the edge of perception, unrecognized and undocumented? The man's case serves as a reminder that the human nervous system, while mapped in gross anatomical terms, is capable of phenomena that evade straightforward explanation. It challenges the assumption that suffering is always private, contained, and attributable to immediate cause. Pain may be both intensely personal and surprisingly relational, a signal that the boundaries of the self are more permeable than previously believed. For physicians observing the man, the condition was both compelling and frustrating. They were drawn to study it, yet the lack of mechanism left them vulnerable to doubt and ridicule. Attempts to intervene, through rest, isolation, or treatment, had limited effect. Each episode reinforced the limits of medical knowledge, demonstrating that expertise alone could not resolve experiences that did not conform to established principles. The man's suffering was not only physiological, it was epistemological, revealing the boundaries of understanding itself. At its core, the case embodies a tension central to the human experience, the interplay between empathy and pathology, awareness and vulnerability, connection and isolation. It demonstrates that extreme sensitivity, whether emotional or neurological, carries real consequences. While empathy is often celebrated as a moral and social virtue, in its extreme forms it may become burdensome or even pathological, producing genuine suffering that is difficult to explain or alleviate. The man's experiences also suggest a continuum between normal and pathological states. Empathy exists in all humans, but in some individuals, neural and psychological processes may amplify its effects to the point of physiological manifestation. His condition, while extraordinary, forces consideration of the broader spectrum of human responsiveness, where subtle differences can have dramatic consequences. It highlights how finely tuned systems of perception and sensation can be disrupted, producing experiences that are both real and alien to the individual. Ultimately, the case raises questions that remain relevant today. How much of human suffering is shaped by relational factors? To what extent can the experiences of others penetrate our nervous system? And when does this penetration become harmful? The Edinburgh man illustrates that empathy, though vital for social functioning, is not without risk. It can transform into a mechanism of suffering, demonstrating that the mind's engagement with others may have profound, measurable effects on the body. In contemplating the man's condition, observers, both then and now, are confronted with the limits of understanding. His pain was unmistakably real, yet it resisted classification. It was neither imaginary nor fully explicable. It existed at the intersection of bodies, minds, and events beyond immediate perception. The case forces a reconsideration of what it means to suffer, and whether suffering can ever be entirely contained within the boundaries of a single self. In doing so, it illuminates the delicate and often perilous boundary between empathy and pathology, a boundary that medicine, despite centuries of advancement, continues to grapple with.